I'm reading to you from the prologue of the Gospel of John. Okay, there is an introduction to the Gospel, which is kind of like a hymn. Scholars believe that once again, the prologue of the Gospel of John was probably a hymn that Christians sang about Christ, about Jesus, that was then kind of reworked, retouched, edited by the author of John's Gospel and used as kind of like an interesting opening for his Gospel. And that's basically what the word prologue means, the word coming before, your opening words, prologue in Greek. We know log from theology, words about God. Okay, these are words that come before the main story. Okay, so John chapter 1 verses 1 to 18. I'll read it for you once and then I'll go over it, the points that I want to make. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. What came to be through him was life, and this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. A man named John was sent from God. He came for testimony, to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. Verse 10. He was in the world, and the world came to be through him, but the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, but his own people did not accept him. But to those who did accept him, he gave power to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not by natural generation, or by human choice, or by man's decision, but of God. Verse 14. And the Word became flesh, and made his dwelling amongst us. And we saw his glory, the glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, saying, This was he of whom I said, The one who is coming after me ranks ahead of me, because he existed before me. From his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace, because while the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only Son, God, who is at the Father's side, has revealed him. Okay? So that's the prologue of John's Gospel. And maybe you've noticed that it doesn't flow exactly well. Okay? It seems to have been something that was taken and then, things were added to it and it's been hacked up and pieced together. The things that are not in bold, well, I'll mention that when I get to it. Let's just start with verse 1. In the beginning, an arche. Where have we heard that before? That word arche. Beginning, principle, foundation, first thing. Well, we just heard it in the letter to the Colossians. Okay, applied to Jesus. And let me check Philippians. I forget, does Philippians also... No. So this is interesting to me that I should look at my thesaurus for another word. I keep saying the word interesting. But the fact that the same word appears is probably not happenstance. It's probably not an accident. Fascinating. Okay. captivating, stimulating, thought-provoking. Okay. Keep these in my arsenal, my vocabulary arsenal. That the Word was from the beginning. Okay, and that was probably means existed from the beginning. If we read it in context, which we will later in the prologue. And Colossians says that Christ is the beginning. So this is pushing it even more literally. Jesus is not just the beginning, meaning the firstborn from the dead, but Jesus is from the beginning. He's the beginning literally, because he was there from the beginning. And it's talking about Jesus. You can't tell that immediately, but by the time you get to verse 6, and it mentions John, who's pretty, John the Baptist, John the Baptizer. It's becomes clearer that about whom it's talking. Okay, but this is a symbol. It's a metaphor. Okay, Jesus is being called the Word of God. This word hologos, and there's your definition. It is a Greek word applied to Jesus, and it means a variety of things. All of them centered around speaking, the act of speaking or forming words. Okay, so that's what he calls Jesus here, and says this Logos was with God, so somehow in the presence of God, and the Word was God. And I give you the whole Greek phrase statement there. Kai theos ein ho logos, and God was the Word, literally. This word theos simply means God. You could translate it as the Word was divine. You could also translate it as the Word was a God. Okay? But the word simply means God. So the theos, God, is being applied to the Word, which is a metaphor for Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Christ. So you really can't get around that. Jesus is being called divine. He's being called God. And what that means, he's not God, because God is mentioned right above that. Okay, so he's not not equivocating. He's not. What's the word I'm looking for? Well, I'll have to talk around it. He wasn't making the word equivalent to the God, but he was saying the Word was God. Whatever John means by that, or the hymn means by that. But it is certainly, appears to be certainly an affirmation that Jesus, the belief had become that Jesus was divine. He was not just a man. There was something godly about him. He was not just sent from God, but he was God who was sent, or who came. Okay. Oh, I should tell you a little bit of background about the Gospel, just quickly. The Gospel of John, as you should know, is the fourth Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it comes last, and it was probably written last out of the four. Scholars typically date the Gospel of John to around 90 to 100 AD. 90 to 100 AD. So relatively late in its composition. But we've seen this progression. There's still a connection. There's nothing surprising, or should be surprising here, in John's prologue that we haven't already seen 40 years earlier in Colossians and 40 or 50 years earlier in Philippians. Okay? Both in Philippians and Colossians we have hymns where Jesus is being given divine attributes and even being described as being in the form of God. Okay, so coming very close, without saying outright, yeah, Jesus is God. It's pretty close to that's what it's saying. I mean, you don't have to, reinterpret it or stretch your imagination very much to see this. Here in the prologue of the Gospel of John, John just comes out and says the word's God. There is a direct connection between Jesus, the Word, of this poem, and God. So he's not beating around the bush. And Jesus is pre-existent. Jesus existed in the beginning even with God. So Jesus is before time. He's before the beginning, when God was, existed, before there was a beginning. And from him, everything came into existence. So notice he doesn't say from God. He doesn't mean God. All things came to be through him. John doesn't mean God there. He means the Logos. So God used the word, the Logos, in creation. Okay, so this gives Jesus of Nazareth a much greater role in the history of mankind than just some, religious founder who, whatever, people listen, he was a teacher and a prophet and whatever. This is making a claim that Jesus was part of, or was acting with God in creation, right, and created the world. Skipping down, the verses about John the Baptist were probably added probably by the author of John's Gospel. They don't seem to fit very well with the rest of the hymn. So scholars, a lot of scholars, are pretty much in agreement that this section, or the sections that talk about John the Baptizer, were added to the hymn, because the author does not want you to think that John was the Word. Okay, he doesn't want. John had followers himself. John the Baptist was a prophet, believed to be a prophet by Christians, not by Jews, though. Not by modern Jews, I should say. But John the Baptizer was not the light. He was not the light which came into the world. He was not the Word made flesh. And so whoever wrote this wanted to make that very clear, because John still had followers, and people might be like, hey, why should I follow Jesus? I follow John. John's fine. And the person is saying, no, John came to testify and witness to the light of the world, the Word that was coming into the world, okay, who is Jesus, not John. John was a witness to Jesus, not vice versa. Okay, let's skip down to verse 11. The Word came to what was his own, but his own people did not accept him. That expression, ta idia, his own things. It's an odd phrase, an odd state, or an odd phrase, but it basically means his own stuff, the stuff that was his, and even the people of Israel who were his. But ta'idia above probably is being used in a more general sense, and since the Word was the agent of creation, meaning that all of the created world, the angels, physical universe, etc., came to be through him, came into existence through him, then this is literally true for the author. It was his own. It was his own stuff. He made it. He was the agent of creation. Okay? We'll skip down to the rest. And the Word became flesh. Now we have the recurrence of this metaphor for Jesus. The Logos, the Word became flesh. Notice I give you the Greek term sarx, which means flesh, for a reason. Because it could have said the Word became a body, or took on a body. Right? But it doesn't. There's a different Greek word for that. It's very, very clear, this word sarx, for flesh. Okay? It's a very particular, definitive kind of word. You can't get around what the author is saying. He's saying that the Word, which is God, became literally human flesh, bone, muscle, skin. Okay, that's what sarx means. It means flesh. It means meat. The meat on your bones, your muscles, your skin, your nerves, everything. Okay? Body could mean, he took on a body, like an appearance. Or, he filled a body, like water can be poured into a glass. Sarx is more realistic. more transformative. The Word became flesh. Didn't fill flesh, all right, or seem to be flesh. The Word, the Logos, and His flesh as a man were one and the same. Okay? When you saw Jesus, you saw the Word. There was no difference. And we saw His glory. His glory. The glory as of the Father's only Son. Okay, so now we're getting into this idea of God as now a Father, and the Word as His Son. Only Son. Now it's even more specific. Not just that Jesus is the Son, the Word is the Son, but He's the only one. There is no other. The Father has only a Son. Doesn't have sons. Okay? Not plural. He has a Son. There's one Word. And to see the Word in the flesh was to see His glory. So again, this idea of glory, which is an idea, a concept typically applied to the divine, to God. God is glorious. You can talk about human beings as glorious, but in the context of a religious writing, glory is usually, you would expect it to be said of God or a spiritual being, and this is now being applied to the Son of God, Jesus, and to see Him in the flesh was to see God's, not just glory in general, but specifically the glory of God, of the Father, in His Son. We can skip over 15 and 16. That's probably an addition. 16 is thought-provoking, because that word pleroma, to pleroma, occurs again in a different writing from a different author in a different context, but still talking about Jesus, that Jesus is the fullness, and we've received the fullness. We receive the fullness in Him. And the final statement, no one has seen God, which seems to contradict verse 14, where it says that we saw the glory in God, in the Father's only Son. But remember, when he says God here, he means God the Father. The author hasn't figured out necessarily, knows there's a difference. There's the Son and the Father, there's the Word and God, there's Jesus and God, and there's a relationship, very clear relationship between them, between the two, but still, kind of just reverts to saying God is God and Jesus is something else, to make the distinction. But that doesn't mean it's a denial. No one has ever seen God. True. Okay, you don't see the Father, because the Father did not become flesh. It was the Son who became flesh. Verse 14. This only Son, so now it can say, this only Son, which it's mentioned above, has revealed God. Okay, so the God has not been seen by anybody, but in His Son He has been revealed. He has been uncovered and shown forth to people. Okay? So once again, going back up to 14, we saw His glory. The glory of what? The glory of God the Father. How? Indirectly through His Son, who is also God. Okay? And there is a clear, once again, we end with the beginning. The Word is called God in verse 1, and verse 18, the Son is called God. The only begotten Son, God. Okay, the only begotten Son, God. Homonogenes huios theos. Okay, so the word theos is again applied to the Word, who is called Son here. Alright, so we kind of end where we started.